welcome back to Tricks Out. I'm Tricks, your hostess. So today what I'm going to talk about is a CNC machine I bought about 5 years ago, a CNC router, and it's just a little baby thing, used, total hobbyist thing, called BobsCNC the E3, and I believe it's the first generation that that company came out with, and it works well for carving stuff out and cutting pieces out. But as far as engraving, it leaves a lot to be desired. So I'm going to do some upgrades on this thing. And I think it's going to be about a 3-part, maybe a 4-part video series on the things I'm going to do to it. So let me show you that. Just a second. Okay, so here's Bob's E3 CNC machine. And this is, like I said, the first machine they made. Their more recent machines are a lot better than this one. And it works, like I said, great for cutting stuff out because the bit just needs to go, all the way through the material and cut around it, which isn't hard to do. The problem is when you're engraving. Okay, here's an example of what I mean by the engraving issue. This is just a piece of scrap. It became scrap because of what I'm going to show you in a second here. So just ignore that and that, and just focus on this part right here. You'll see that the router was going around in circles. And when it got out here, it stopped touching the plexiglass. This part here should look like this part here. And the finish is awful as well. And I've improved it. I think I really did a lot of research on bits to use for engraving plexiglass and the speed at which you should have your router spinning and the advancement of the router through the plexiglass. So I think I've fixed that kind of stuff. But this is what I'm now trying to focus on, is making sure that that kind of thing doesn't happen again. So there you go. This is just a rod I put in here that I made sure it was perfectly straight. And this has to be completely perpendicular to the bed, and the bed has to be flat. So right now I've gotten it as close as I possibly can, and you can see in this direction it's pretty good, but it's still a little off. Let's see if I can get this over here in this direction. You can see that little bit right there. But it's a bunch better than it was in the beginning. So when I first flatten my bit, you use these bits here to flatten your table. And so they have to run perfectly perpendicular to the table, like I said. So I did it, and it felt funky when I rubbed my hand along the table. So I took a crayon and rubbed it on a piece of paper, and that's the result I got. And then I went through this business of trying to get this thing to be completely perpendicular and put this thing into contortions, and you can see how wonky it is. And I mean, I worked so hard trying to get this thing to work, and it got a lot better. Here's the second crayon test. But what I want to do is rethink this whole system here so that I can adjust the perpendicular, the plumbness of the router by just adjusting some screws rather than going through this business here. So that's one thing I'm going to do in this series. The other thing that this thing needed was the back to be fortified. It only had this green part here, none of this business. And so I added all this to strengthen the gantry, make it a lot more stiff, and that really improved things as well. Also, these bearings need to be so tight that they move whatever it is they're supposed to be moving, rather than just spin when you go like that to them. So and to do that with this design, you have to like squeeze it with your hands and then tighten it at the same time. And there's a bolt on the back, so you have to hold the bolt, squeeze, and tighten the screw at the same time. It's very hard to do if you don't have super strong hands and all that other stuff. And so what I did was I printed these eccentric nuts. Let me see if we can get one here. Eccentric nuts on my 3D printer, and use that. And that way I can adjust the bearing to squeeze up against these rails or rods or whatever you want to call them. And that helped a lot too. Also, the belts need to be super tight. They need to sound like a drum. And on the belt that's on the gantry, you have to squeeze this have something behind here to hold the bolt back here, squeeze this and screw this down to get this to be nice and tight. And I used a clamp to do that. I clamped this, held the bolt, and then screwed that in. Well, I'm gonna put an eccentric nut on here too, so that would make it really easy to tighten that belt up. And then the last thing I'm gonna do is I've been designing a dust boot for this thing. And it's gonna be a universal dust boot that you can put on, I think, pretty much any CNC router. And the thing with the dust boot on this thing is if it's attached down here and you go to home, the gantry and the router, excuse me, it's gonna crash into this. So the boot has to pivot out of the way when it goes to home itself. You could do an extension on the switch so that it stops before that happens, but I just don't want to do that. So I'm designing a dust boot that will pivot out of the way when it goes to home. And I think it's going to be pretty cool. And it's also not going to be, it's going to be steady when the Z-axis is moving up and down. So the Z-axis isn't going to cause the brush to move, which causes other problems. It'll make sense in the video. So those are the different parts that I am going to do in this video. In the next two clips, you'll see how the gantry was improved by the adding of the supports in the back. But the router mount still twists a little bit after adding that. So I think if I improve the bearings and how tight they can be, that will improve that. We'll see. Instead of taking this all off and showing you, I'm just going to explain that I cut a whole bunch of clearances in this to clear bolts that were, already in this part of the gantry. So there's one, you can see the little nut down or the screw down there. So I cut clearances there. I had to cut clearances up in here, and so other places. There's a clearance right there, and here, where's my finger? Yep, right over here. You can see there's clearances there. So basically I just routed out or used my table saw to cut clearances so that I didn't have to remove any of the screws from the gantry when I attached this. The thinking was that I didn't want to disturb the alignment of the gantry because it was fine if it was just sitting there. It's when it moved that the problems occurred. So instead of building the structure and then putting it on, I built the structure around the gantry.